Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that everybody can hear and see me well. My name is Aleksandra Mączyńska, and I'm Executive Director at 𝗵𝗲 Finance. For those who are not yet familiar with 𝗵𝗲 Finance, we are an EU-level NGO based here in Brussels, and we represent the interests of financial services users, individual investors, pension savers, and a very wide category of what we call financial consumers. We are very happy to have today with us in the afternoon a very interesting panel that will be devoted to the topic of individual investor protection in the context of EU sustainable finance strategy. We have been debating and advocating for individual investor access to really suitable sustainable finance products. We know very well from the individual members of our national member organizations that the demand for such product is quite high, but also the expectations as to the quality of those products is high. There are also some concerns as to whether the investor protection is for the time being high enough in order to prevent and to protect investors against any mis-selling scandals that would involve sustainable finance products. So today in the afternoon, we are going to discuss during the panel debate the issues of how to successfully and efficiently protect individual investors. We are going to discuss how to guarantee some minimum standards and sustainability performance of sustainable investment products that are addressed to individual investors. And we are going also to discuss what kind of measures we really need to prevent greenwashing. As we all know, and as we have been also advocating already for some time and also providing research that is confirming this, individual investors are really long-term oriented. So we were wondering also, and we are going to discuss this with our panelists today, how to ensure that individual investors can really easily engage into investing companies. And we as 𝗵𝗲 Finance have conducted research to that point, and some of the findings are going to be also discussed during the panel discussion today. We are going to also to discuss, whether fintech could also play a significant role in providing access to good quality sustainable finance products. And also in this area and in this scope, 𝗵𝗲 Finance for another time this year has conducted a research on robo-advisory platforms, where we are looking not only whether those platforms provide really suitable products to individual investors, but we were also looking whether the platforms offer access to sustainable finance products. And the first findings of our research is confirming that the situation is quite different depending on the provider. And what is already concerning us is that in the questionnaire offered by robo-advisors, quite often the questions concerning the sustainability preferences of individual investors are missing. Therefore, we are wondering how suitable really the algorithms are that then are offering at the end of the questionnaire sustainable finance products as the suitable one for the different profiles of the investors that we have tested. But before we are going to discuss those issues within the panel discussion, we are going to have today with us also the keynote speaker from Poland, the Deputy Financial Ombudsman, 𝗬𝗲, who is going to tell us how the situation of financial services users and individual investors looks in Poland. I must say that I'm particularly happy that 𝗬𝗲 is with us today, as I, to a certain extent, see how the history and financial consumers protection made a circle. We used to protect Polish consumers together with 𝗬𝗲 in the Polish consumer watchdog, Office of Competition and Consumer Protection. Then we parted ways, but right now both of us are really working quite hard to protect financial consumers. 𝗬𝗲 right now is the Deputy Polish Ombudsman. He's also supervising banking and capital market customer department. and he was also quite active here on the Brussels arena. He was quite often representing the interests of consumers in the negotiations at the level of the Council of the European Union. So without much further ado and unnecessary introductions, I will give the floor to Paweł. I just wanted to let know everybody and our attendees that unfortunately Paweł Zagaj today is extremely busy, so we will not have time for the questions, but we will be able to discuss many of the challenges that I have mentioned during the panel discussions right afterward. So right now, over to you, Paweł, and thank you for accepting our invitation to speak today at the high-level expert forum for sustainable finance.
Welcome, everybody. It is a pleasure to attend in this great event. I wish to start by extending my warm thanks to the organizers for inviting the Polish financial ombudsman in this impactful meeting. In particular, please let me thank Anna Molczyńska from Better Finance for her efforts and hospitality. I express my gratitude to all guests and representatives for taking part in this much needed discussion. It is a great pleasure to join you today and in continuing the discussion about sustainable finance for individual investors. Today, one of the most crucial challenges, but also duties of governments is to stimulate economic growth. It is no secret that a well-developed and efficient capital market is a key when facing challenges like aging of society or pandemic. Necessary actions are needed to encourage individual investors to become interested in capital market instruments. Recently, there have been significant developments in this field. For example, the Polish government, in cooperation with European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, established the Capital Market Development Strategy. Its main objective is to create conditions for social, economic, and environmental development. It consists of 90 concrete actions aiming at financial integrations of individual investors into the capital market. However, the role of institutions like the Financial Ombudsman is to call for adequate care of individual investors' protection. Not only the economic sense is decisive for the decisions, but primarily consumer protection is the cornerstone of inclusive and sustainable development. Capital market development starts to rely on concept of sustainable finance. It has been established in line with the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and in the EU Action Plan for Financing Sustainable Growth. The concept of sustainability is extremely multidimensional. It is not only aimed at pro-ecological investment, but it also targets social exclusion. Therefore, when deliberating about sustainable investments and products among potential individual investors, from the perspective of the Financial Ombudsman and in the context of consumer protection, we need to highlight three factors. First, the complex issue of integrating sustainable finance into the investor protection scheme needs to be addressed, especially the area of encouraging individual investors to long-term investments. It is especially relevant in the context of retirement savings. Currently, the average remuneration replacement rate amounts to about 40%. In near future, the pension system will no longer meet the minimum standards. In consequence, pensions will be insufficient. Therefore, promoting low risk and long-term investments should have top priority. Secondly, we need to address the extensive use of new technologies in the banking and investment sectors, as there are many potential threats to consumer protection there. Last, and most definitely not least, enhanced trust in financial market is one of the greatest goals for the next decade. High level of protection needs to be provided to all individual investors so that the law and enforcement measures create a certain legal environment allowing for efficient allocation of capital. We are convinced that the efficient financial ombudsman institutions and effective ADR schemes have the potential of improving trust among consumers as well as providers. Sustainable finance plays a key role in delivering the policy objectives under the European Green Deal, as well as the EU international commitments on climate and sustainability objectives. It does this by channeling private investments into the transition to a climate neutral, climate resilient, resource efficient, and fair economy. Sustainable finance will help ensure that investments support a resilient economy and sustainable recovery from the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. Sustainable finance refers to the process of taking environmental and governance considerations into account when making investment decisions in the financial sectors, leading to more long-term investments in sustainable economic activities and projects. As we acknowledge so far, investing in such activities and projects is one of the strongest ways to help ensure long-term sustainable results. And environmental considerations may include climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, as well as the environment more broadly, for instance, the preservation of biodiversity, pollution prevention, and the circular economy. Social considerations could refer to issue of inequality, inclusiveness, labor relations, investment in human capital and communities, as well as human rights issues. The governance of public and private institutions, including management structures, employee relations, and executive remunerations, plays a fundamental role in ensuring the inclusion of social and environmental considerations in the decision-making process. The financial sector has a key role to play in reaching those goals. It can reorient investment towards more sustainable technology and business. Second, finance growth in a sustainable manner over the long term. And finally, contribute to the creation of a low-carbon, climate-resilient, and circular economy. To achieve those goals, the investment products distributor must be aligned with new obligations on sustainability investments. It is worth mentioning that sometimes ESG investments are less profitable, combined with a lack of knowledge of ESG financial products. Even when investors are well informed and even strongly convinced of the potential benefits, the complexity of investment decisions overwhelm them. The integration of sustainability considerations into the investment, advisory and disclosure process in a consistent manner across sectors is important. When providing portfolio management, investment firms and insurance intermediaries must assess whether their investment services, financial instruments, or insurance-based investment products are suitable for a particular client. Sustainability factors and risk have to be taken into consideration, as well as new sustainability tests. Requiring investment advisors to ask about and then respond to retail investors' preference about the sustainable impact of their investments, as a routine component of financial advice is one thing. The rule governing the relationship between product distributors and their clients are vital. But reorienting investor capital towards sustainable investment requires essentials such as successful educational actions explaining sustainability investments to the consumer, as well as quick solution resolving dispute concerning ESG products. From our perspective, providing educational background and an efficient dispute resolution scheme dealing with financial sustainable investment service seems to be even greater challenge than ESG investments itself. Proper educational background would help potentially interested buyers to better identify and assess material risk and growth opportunities before even they would make their investment decisions. Educational initiatives would facilitate investor engagement and increase social awareness. Financial education is also necessary when speaking about the evolving new technologies, which are another key area that needs to be tackled. New technologies have changed the investment and banking market for good. The pandemic has only accelerated the introduction of technical solutions. Consumers have found themselves in a new, much more digital reality. Undoubtedly, many of the introduced innovations, especially in terms of access to service, automation, and personalization of products, are convenient for consumers. Some of the changes serve to increase data security and effectively verify users in line with Payment Service Directive 2. We are slowly getting used to the new terminology, such as fintechs, insurtechs, big data, and artificial intelligence. The financial services market is changing rapidly, right in front of us. Nevertheless, digitalization is not only an opportunity for market development, but also potential risk for its participants, in particular consumers and investors. Let me point out a few identified risks and approaches. First, fintech operator fraud or misconduct. Because fintech business models can be innovative or complex, and many consumers are not familiar with them, they can lead to increased risk of loss from fraud or misconduct by operators or related parties. Establishing competence requirements for these market players, as well as mandatory licensing or registration, can help address this issue. Second, platform technology unreliability or vulnerability. If a fintech platform or other system based on fintech offering are unreliable or vulnerable to external threats, they can expose consumers to higher risk of loss and other harm, including from third-party fraud. Approaches to address these challenges include technology and outsourcing specific risk management, operational reliability, and competence requirements for operators. Third, consumer disclosure and transparency in digital context. The standard risk arising from consumer not being provided with adequate product information are increased when new types of pricing, product features, and risk are introduced, and when digital channels for communications are difficult to understand for consumers. Fourth, increased risk of product unsuitability. Fintech can increase access to riskier or complex financial products to consumer. When they have lacked the knowledge or experience to access or use them properly, it may to lead them to greater risk of harm due to product unsuitability. Possible solutions include limits on individual investments for less knowledgeable consumers and product suitability obligations for fintech operators. Thereof, how to best protect consumers and individual investors in a new fintech-driven reality. How to make sure that court and regulatory decisions are enforceable against those new players. The answer to this question might lie in effective enforcement and redress mechanism. The greatest strategy that we can undertake in order to boost sustainable finance is to increase trust in financial market. The level of protection secured to individual investors needs to be high for them to feel secure in their actions. To create a certain investment environment for investors, the enforcement measures need to be appropriate. Of course, introducing new legislation or even specialized courts that specialize in financial market may be a good start. However, the experience and measures adopted in some of the most developed countries point to the fact that alternative dispute resolution may be a viable solution, especially in the potential cross-border disputes. We need to be highlighted, what needs to be highlighted is that the EU encourages simple, efficient, fast, and low-cost ways of resolving domestic and cross-border dispute, which has been expressed in the ADR directive. Historically, it has always been the financial service ombudsman schemes that dealt with cases concerning banking, insurance, and investment sector. Financial ombudsmen around the world cover not only investment providers and their agents, but also intermediaries, such as banks and independent financial advisors. The benefits of accessible, effective, and independent dispute resolution to financial consumers and individual investors have been acknowledged in many countries in Europe and even globally. A network of national alternative dispute resolution schemes, FinNet, is guided by the ADR directive. It is growing towards to full coverage of the spectrum of financial services in all member states. For a more effective enforceability of cross-border decisions. What is interesting in the context of today's discussion is that FinNet members reported a significant increase in cross-border cases concerning the investment sector. And in 2018, investment ranked above insurance. Notably, consumers mainly complain about pension frauds, around 30%, and administration issues. Another international organization, the Info Network, which brings together ombudsman practitioners from around the world, sets out good practices which guide development of effective financial services ombudsman schemes. The schemes that have proven to be most effective usually require financial institutions to take part in the scheme, as in Ireland, the UK, the Netherlands, or Australia or New Zealand. In addition, the rulings are of binding nature on the provider, but not binding on the consumer, what is significant. According to their findings, Financial Ombudsman Service help to underpin consumer trust and confidence in financial and investment service. Of course, it needs to be highlighted that ADR schemes are not an alternative to effective regulations, but surely are complementary to it. Summarizing my speech, I would like to say that Polish financial ombudsman acknowledged that due to the novel character of ESG investments, the risk of mis-selling or claims based on greenwashing of financial products is present. Providing solutions to disputes and complaints concerning ESG financial products, accelerated with the use of fintech, seems to be of utmost importance. In the wake of changes in financial markets and sustainable finance, it is our belief that the financial ombudsman schemes can bridge the gap in the delivery of justice for individual investors. In doing so, effective ADR schemes can also help providers by giving feedback and the causes and nature of complaints, supporting self-regulation and supplementing effective enforcement. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to panel 3, which is all about individual investors' protection in the context of the EU Sustainable Financial Strategy. We will also take a look at the international side because the EU, of course, doesn't function on its own. But before I start, and I have a very distinguished panel of no less 6 experts, so the challenge is on me to keep us all within the time. Let me start by alphabetical order with Carlos Araujo, who is a senior analyst for Allianz France and working on sustainable investment, innovation, and governance. Next, I have Jella Benner-Heinacher, Chief Managing Director, Deutsche Schutzvereinigung für Wertpapierbesitz. And excuse my German, Jella. She is, of course, the Chief Managing Director of 𝗬𝗲, but also Vice President of Better Finance in Brussels and a great connection for many years. Next, 𝗂𝗍𝗶𝗃, Chief Responsible Investment Officer for UN Principles for Responsible Investment and Chair of the Sustainable Finance Platform, long time working on EU taxonomy and at the national United Nations level, and also part of the Secretariat for the UK Green Finance Task Force. Next, I have Kęstutis Kupšys, member of the European Economic and Social Committee, Vice President of the Lithuanian Consumers Alliance. He also represents consumer interest in the payment systems market expert group at DG FISMA, and also in occupational pensions at EIOPA. So again, really representing both at the EU level and at the national level consumers. I have to ask, there's one, probably if you can mute your mics, because I can have a lot of background noise. Thank you. Andreas Rajchl, who is Policy Officer in DG FISMA in the Sustainable Finance Unit. He joined in September 2020 and is working, of course, on the Commission's new strategy for financing transition to a sustainable economy and the platform for finance. And last but not least, Villiers, Director of Sustainable Finance at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. He's leading on sustainability, helping financial institutions play a leading role in building a more sustainable economy, working with banks, insurance, and the investment industry, looking at research tools and frameworks, again, bringing the practicality to the sustainable economy. So when we looked at this, this is a huge topic, and we have to condense it in an hour and a half with all sorts of different views. But looking at it, I can see from the point of view of CFA Institute, and of course I work for CFA Institute as head of regulatory outreach. 6 actions really are needed to have an effective transition to sustainable investing practices and looking at the impact of sustainable investing. And I think they serve as a backdrop for what we will discuss. One is ESG education. For from all aspects, whether it's the investor, whether it's the practitioner, whether it's the regulator. Too much is happening. We all need to keep abreast with it. System level thinking, again, integrating it into the system is absolutely key. But also a collaboration theory, focus on stewardship. Really, dialogue is important, and that is at the heart of collaboration. Data. How can we not have data when we need to invest and when we need to understand what is going on? But again, this is a challenge, new ways of getting data. There's very large amounts of data. So we need to understand the material and validity of all that information coming at us, whether it's investors or practitioners or regulators. Innovation. Again, innovation is going to help us move through the transition. And lastly, a purposeful culture. And that is, of course, at the heart of the greenwashing issues, and it's a key issue. Now, I just want to turn to something that 𝗀𝘂𝗀𝗃𝗃, CEO of Better Finance, said from yesterday's day one of the conference. There seems to be really throughout all the different panels, working groups, etc., something stands out in that it is crucial to have investor engagement, and this is only possible if there is protection and transparency. And again, when we look at what people are expecting, and I'm saying people, not investors, because there was an Edelman Trust survey in 2021, which clearly shows that whether it's investors, consumers, employees, they are expecting to have a seat at the table. So especially when we look at the future of this finite world, this is really key. And we shouldn't forget it. We need to have everyone on board. So again, this is a crucial aspect of getting that investor participation. But now let me turn to the panelists and give them a short introductory statement so they can give the high-level view before we dig into the more key questions that we have. I'm going to start with UNPRI, with Nathan. Nathan, what is the role of the UNPRI in promoting a more sustainable financial system? You are at the heart and probably at the very initiation of all of this. So to you to give us a few high-level remarks on that.
Thanks, Jessina. Hi, everyone. You might know that the responsible investment movement has been around for some time, well over 15 years, I'd say, as a formal grouping or community. And after a few years' work, we realized that just trying to incorporate ESG data into our practices was not going to be enough. We needed a much broader field of view. And so we started to work at PRI deliberately on system reform, on financial system reform. And to us, this was about enabling responsible investors to in fact be responsible investors, because the system is so interconnected and of course so many actors. So we started by identifying what we felt wasn't working well in the system, and then thought we can group this into dealing with regulation, with market structure, and with the practices of not just asset owners, asset managers, but all the actors that sit around the system, the proxy advisors, the consultants, the legal advice, the investment banking arms of those that we work with on bringing investments to market. And we started thinking about how we interact. Some good old systems theory. Look at the way we're interacting. Look at what positively reinforces our responsible action and what undermines it. Where there are weaknesses, we work directly with those other partners in the industry, and we see if we can do it better. Where there's a market structure issue, where there's a regulation, then we work with the regulators, the market supervisors, the institutions to see what we can change. Again, your 6 areas of work are excellent because they're interrelated. So we do this work so that we can make sure we align with our purpose ultimately. And for that was to enable the original vision of responsible investment, of course, and that was a sustainable system users, so the citizen savers, as we like to call them, but also the community more broadly. And that was why we realized this system approach was essential.
Thank you, Nathan. You've condensed 15 years into a few sentences. That is admirable. So, Andreas, I'm going to turn to you because the EU is not following in the footsteps it did in the beginning, but it's marching to its own tune a little bit. But it is taking into account what is happening at the international level. But we are a sandbox in the EU, really trying out, and being very brave and really moving this whole agenda at a very fast pace, which is perhaps slightly unusual for the EU. What measures has the EU put in place to encourage sustainability investments and prevent greenwashing? Now, that second part, of course, is harder because all the pieces of legislation have just started, but maybe you can highlight some issues.
Thank you, Josina, and good afternoon. I think the approach that the EU and the Commission has taken in the last years really is also a system-wide approach, similar to what Nathan has said. In 2018, when we presented our first action plan on sustainable finance, it became clear that you need to put in the foundations for a sustainable finance ecosystem. And building on that, then you can develop the tools that you need for retail investors to actually make informed decisions. And these foundations are, I think you've heard them before, the taxonomy to have a common understanding of what is a sustainable investment, disclosures by non-financials and financials, so that you have the information and the data available, and then you can build tools on top of that. When it comes to individual and retail investors, I think there are two objectives broadly. One is we would like to encourage retail investors to make informed decisions, but also to invest into sustainable finance products. We also want them to participate more. And then the second objective is, of course, to ensure that they can trust into the greenness of the financial products that they are buying. So on encouraging the investors, what have we done? We've, for instance, introduced a requirement for financial advisors, both in banks, in insurance companies, and outside, to check with their retail clients their sustainability preferences. It is mandatory to do this as part of the suitability assessment, and it ensures that the advice that clients are getting is linked to their preferences on sustainability. There is also requirements on what can be offered to those clients then. And we are also working on financial literacy and on the expertise of financial advisors. I'm not going to go into much detail here. We can return to that if you want later. And then the second part is about preventing greenwashing. The Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation establishes disclosure rules for financial investment products. And this really is about providing the information to the investor that it needs to make a decision about the sustainability. And it's also about ensuring that if financial companies sell products that are marketed as sustainable or marketed with sustainability features or characteristics, to know what's in there and what type of possibly still negative impact is around these products. We will also look at the supervisory enforcement in the medium term. And if you want, we can speak about this. But of course, our policies are being implemented at the moment, and this will be an objective in the next couple of years while the implementation is happening.
It's an ambitious plan. You are addressing most of the issues, but of course, we have to remember that the EU functions both at the EU level and at the national level and within an international context. And when we look at investors, they are consumers, and the consumers are protected by national law. So these are some of the challenges that we face. But I think it's a very ambitious, and I often say it, but the whole green agenda or the sustainability agenda started in 2015 with the CMU action plan when it was half a sentence, and it's quite remarkable in almost 7 years what has been achieved. Nick, I'm going to turn to you from the academic side. Now, most of the measures on sustainability that have been discussed in all the various jurisdictions and at global level only try to address climate issues. How can we encourage investments to look also at social objectives? And I think climate specifically, of course, impacts social issues, where it's migrants, whether it's, I lived through the worst fires in Greece this summer, and I could see some of the social impact. So we cannot leave that behind, but how can we really incorporate it? Nick.
Thank you, Justina. It's a fantastic question. I think, as you said, from the academic standpoint, we're a department of the University of Cambridge, and we have been working for 30 years around topics of sustainability and view, in its most simple form, we think about people, nature, and climate. You're right that a huge amount of work that's been done historically has focused on climate and actually on climate mitigation as well, rather than even climate adaptation, which I think is something that is an area that needs increasing focus, and understand maybe a focus of COP27 going forward, which will be very welcome. But I guess if we think about people, nature, and climate and unpack that a little bit, we think we need to create resilient and inclusive societies that protect and restore nature whilst decarbonising the economy. And so we work on that, and I completely agree with your priorities you set out earlier, education being hugely important. We work with both individuals and companies to provide education to their leadership. We sit as the sort of crossover point between academia and business and finance, so trying to bring, as you said, that sort of practical aspect to it. And what we've done is try to develop tools and frameworks working with industry participants in order to broaden the scope of work. Historically, I would have said over the 30 years, even our work has largely focused on climate, and yet we've moved recently into working with our banks in the Banking Environment Initiative and investors through the Investment Leaders Group to develop a nature-related financial risk framework, so that investors and banks can understand how the destruction of nature feeds into financial risks. And we've got the framework out there. We're working with TNFD and other groups to sort of implement that, but also we're working with into use cases to actually show what can be done now by financial institutions to really embed nature-related risks into their thinking and try and design products that address those. We've also developed the Sustainable Investment Framework, which, again, with our Investment Leaders Group, which distills the 17 Sustainable Development Goals from the UN into 6 categories, where the investors can, or asset owners really, can measure and understand the impact that their investments are having on the world. And there we have 3 environmental, one of which is climate, the other 2 are broader environmental, and 3 social measures. So again, trying to create that balance. And then we're also working on, we're hoping to start a piece of work early in the new year, looking at the financial materiality of inequalities. Because we've been hearing from our members across the banking, the investment and the insurance world that I guess the last 18 months have really laid bare the level of inequalities existing in society, and people are getting concerned about the risks that is going to be bringing forward and thinking about how they can address them. So we're going to be, again, coming up with a risk framework to help people understand, but also mitigating actions. What is the role of financial institutions in addressing some of these social issues? And then finally, we're also helping investors understand how their investments contribute to decent work in terms of living wages, in terms of rights of association, health and safety at work. So I think how we encourage investors to do that, sometimes we actually need to take a step back and think about what we're trying to solve for and creating frameworks that are open, simple, robust, and transparent. And so that's how we're trying to move things forward at our end.
Thank you. And certainly it is with the fast pace of change and the challenges, the huge challenges facing us, to take a step back, because sometimes when we're right in the midst of all the different issues being thrown at us, we cannot see the wood for the trees. So I'm going to turn to someone who needs to apply all these different measures. Allianz, Carlos, in your work on sustainability, innovation, governance, what is the Allianz viewpoint on the current EU legislative framework on sustainable finance? What are the challenges for you to apply these measures? Carlos. Carlos, you're mute. Carlos? Carlos, you're mute.
Carlos is having difficulty hearing you. I don't know if he can hear me, but...
I can hear you. Carlos cannot hear me. Okay, so I'm going to turn, maybe Anais can
I just want to make sure that you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
So as a practitioner for the taxonomy and also the person in charge for implementation at Allianz Group, I mean, we have to say that the EU taxonomy, for example, is setting a great common language so that investors, asset owners, and also the whole market can understand what an asset is and what are the qualities of this asset. So setting this common language is good today because it supports markets like the green bond market, which in the past was relying on certifications such as the CDI, or it would have the green bond principles, voluntary principles to be applied. But the taxonomy provides a level of detail that it's useful enough because now we can take out some industries that were stigmatized before for emitting too many emissions and considered to be outside of the contribution to environmental objectives. So we can have now cement, for example, which has its own criteria, which a green bond could be issued in the future in order to support the financing of cement if it respects the technical criteria. But we also have further details on even on renewable energies, on how to protect biodiversity when it comes to a wind farm, and at the same time we can have other types of requirements for different assets where there were debates before, and now I think the taxonomy just cancels this debate and we're all speaking the same language. When it comes to SFDR, it's another regulation that is setting some good standards. I see that you're having some issues in terms of understanding. But if you can hear me at this point, then there's another part which is the challenging implementation of the taxonomy as a regulation, and also in terms of SFDR. We have a lot of procedures to put in place. We have a sustainable finance implementation project that was created for the sole purpose of addressing all these regulations. It has different work streams and third-party responsibilities allocated to different colleagues that were doing finance before, who were in the part of equities. And there are also some interactions that are challenging enough because we are not only dealing with listed assets. We also have to deal with the unlisted part of Allianz. And as a company that has over 1 trillion of investments, not all of them are in the same asset class. So there's a different approach that needs to be implemented for each and one of them of this. And in that case, it puts a lot of effort to be made internally. There's also challenges in terms of the delays in which by the time that we receive the information, we have set a process, so we have to readapt. So we're feeling at some point that we're shooting at a moving target in order to comply with this regulation, which we believe to be the right one, but at the same time, it has its implementation concerns. Thank you. I expect you were able to hear me.
Carlos, we have a little bit of patchy hearing with you, so maybe Better Finance Anais can take a look and help you with the sound. I did catch most of it though, and I think what I really did hear was how it's all teams and all hands on board basically to incorporate all the different challenges. So I think that is for the industry, for the financial industry, a real challenge. It's not just compliance officers, it's all through the chain. Everybody has to apply the legislation. I think that is really a big challenge. Now I'm going to turn to Kęstutis. The EESC is a very important consultative body for the European Commission and other EU co-legislators. What is the stakeholders' view on EU initiatives on sustainable finance? We see you as an August body sort of nodding and saying, well, we may think this or this, but how does it work in practice? Do you give positive and negative feedback? What is the sort of procedures there? That would be great to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Josina, for the introduction. It's really, yes and no. Sometimes we give high marks, sometimes we criticize the Commission, the legislators, and the ESC is a very interesting body in its composition because it consists of 1/3 coming from employers, 1/3 from employees, and 1/3 of the rest. So it tries to represent the organized civil society in Europe. And we are sometimes underrated with our importance, but think of 300 people coming to Brussels to develop joint opinion, and just imagine how difficult it is to reconcile sometimes very diverse views. Think of the industry, the finance industry, the heavy industry, the very polluting industry, and think the environment activists. They are sitting on the completely different ends of the spectrum of opinions. However, in the end, the ESC adopts an opinion which tries to find the common ground, the lowest possible denominator for all. Now, I will offer you a glimpse in an opinion which is developed as we speak, and it is on the renewed sustainable finance strategy announced in July. So the opinion the ESC is producing will be adopted next week at the plenary. So essentially, this is still an internal document, but from our procedures, what I see that the most points are already agreed, and I can offer you a little bit of an insight of what's in there. And for example, which comes very close to what Nick earlier said, the ESC criticizes softly that many of the measures mentioned in the communication we talk about, the renewed sustainable finance strategy, disregard social sustainability. So it's a clear signal what the social partners and the civil society wants from the Commission and the expert community. And of course, we talk about deceptive sustainability washing, which is again a quite importantly different topic than just greenwashing. So we expand the boundaries and we warn about sustainability washing. And of course, we call, being a civil society representation, we call for social partners and civil society to be brought on board in design and implementation and all this stuff. For example, we want to be sufficiently represented in both the Platform on Sustainable Finance and the EFRAG, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. Well, just when I'm thinking what is the composition of the platform, it's clearly not even close to what we try to achieve inside of our committee, with 1/3 of employers, 1/3 of employees, and 1/3 of the remaining civil society groups. So, of course, with every third member of the committee coming from the world of work, we also criticize that the ESG criteria related to the world of work are not really at the center of the debate yet. But essentially, I think everybody is keen to see if we go forward with the social taxonomy, and that will probably change things. So, we express doubts about nuclear energy, of course. And you can just guess kind of what kind of debate it can evoke in in the committee on this. So I'm finishing with this presentation just for you to give a little bit of a view what the committee is doing in this regard. I was, for example, the president of the study group on the delegated act related to climate change, the taxonomy, which was brought to our attention in this spring. Yeah, so it was really amazing to see how much of civil society expertise is in there, because we can have people coming from transport sector pointing directly to certain issues related with delegated acts. And we can also have people from the environment, which call for higher ambition, of course, from the environmentalist organization. So that's a very short overview. I think the opinion will be probably a good read for most of you. And of course, I'm ready to participate in the debate and to respond to your questions if you have.
Thank you. We hear some echoes. I think Kęstutis, maybe from you, if you could mute. I'm going to turn to Jella, last but not least, of course. But I think now we come to what is the view of retail investors and how are Better Finance and DSV promoting that EU legislation and making sure that it is focusing on the retail investor. I think, Kęstutis, you said you have a voice and the committee has been existing many years now, but that's still, and I think within the whole of the legislative process, the EU does take into account different stakeholders, and we see it with the different stakeholder groups of the supervisory authorities, but also of the European Commission itself. But that voice is perhaps still not strong enough, and it needs to be stronger. So I think that was a very good point. But Jella, are you helping financial users and retail investors to gain, let's say, more insight into this whole sustainability package, which is an opportunity and a challenge for investors?
Well, thank you, Gesina. And first of all, let me say thank you for the invitation to this great event. It's great to be here, and it would be even better if you can hear me. So you never know with the technical things. Let me start, Gesina, with the product side, because that's an important part for the retail investor. We see a strong demand from the retail investor side with respect to sustainable financial products. And if we look at the offer side, we do not see that the whole demand is really covered by these products, which of course can create a very dangerous situation, because there is a risk that traditional products are being sold with a green label, and that's what we all call the greenwashing. And already now we see in Germany that the bank advisors get special incentives when they sell green products instead of standard products. So I feel that the issue of greenwashing is coming closer. And you all know the recent case in Germany of the German fund DWS, not to confuse with DSW, which is a major German fund company. They had some greenwashing problems too. So what can we do from the investors' view? I think what we need is, first of all, a clear definition of what sustainable really means. And of course, we have the taxonomy, but still this is not complete. We still do not know whether investments in nuclear companies or in gas are really included or not. The debate is still ongoing. And what is also needed, in my point of view, is you need clear requirements of how green such an investment product should be. And we recently had a recommendation or a guideline from the German supervisory authority, BaFin, and they said, okay, 75% of the investment has to go into green projects to label it as green. And I think we need something similar and very precise also from the European aspect. And once we speak about the product, we also have to take a look at first of all, on the approach with regard to the investment products. We see a variety of different approaches, which is, of course, sometimes a little bit confusing for the investor. We have impact funds, we have best-in-class approaches, we have anything. And again, this is something that the investor has to learn and to understand, and we need as much clear and simple information on that as possible. Again, that's the aspect of sustainability, but the financial product, even if it's sustainable, is just a normal financial product. So we have to take a look at the very important things for the investor, and that's the performance. You know, we have to take a look at the possible return of this product, and we have to take an even closer look in times of negative interest rates on costs and charges, because that has a major influence on the return. So I think this is something we should not forget, and therefore I'm very supportive of the approach of ESMA to establish the 𝗍𝗹, which is like a data platform also on ESG data, because I hope this will help all of us to understand a little bit better. But if I look on the investor and shareholder side, Josina, that's something I would love to emphasize. I think we are in the middle of this transition, as you said, and it's very important that we are all very active and engaging. And that is not only true for the institutional investor, it's also true for investor representatives such as Better Finance and DSW in Germany. And the general meeting, we shouldn't forget about that, can play a major role in this transition procedure. For example, we as shareholder representatives, we focus now much more on climate issues. We go to the companies and ask the directors to explain their climate and sustainability strategy. We will check the sustainability reports. We will have a look at the objectives, at the time schedules, at the KPIs. And to be very honest, I believe if a company has a convincing climate transaction plan, then it should disclose it to its shareholders, and it should ask for their approval at the general meeting. Very important thing. Already in this season, 2021, we saw a lot of very good, positive examples for this movement. Let me give the example of TCI, who proposed a vote on the climate strategy of the Spanish company Aena and succeeded. And we saw also a lot of other companies like Nestle, Unilever, Shell, Total, Iberdrola, and they all put the say on climate on the agenda. And actually, I'm very much convinced, even though we will still have in 2022 probably virtual meetings because of the pandemic, I'm very convinced that say on climate will be the issue where we as investors can also put the issue forward, and we should really go into detail. We should examine the climate actions by the company. We should have a look, is there enough information and enough ambition with respect to scope 1, 2, 3 emissions? And all of this information is just very, very important. And besides the E and the S, we should also not forget the G, because I come from the G side, the governance side. I'm very much fond of that. And I think it is key to have a look at the incentive schemes for the directors. If you have incentives that go into the direction of ambitious ESG objectives, then the things will be moving. And again, we will have a close look at these incentive schemes. I personally think a minimum of 20% of the total pay should be linked to ESG precise KPIs that we can also measure from the outside. So I could go on for hours like this, Josina, but I do not want to blow the event. I will be ready for your questions.
Thank you. And you raised really some key issues on the fact that green products are financial products and they need to be seen as a financial product. The importance of the annual general meeting, whether it's online, but that throws up, and some of the challenges you mentioned about understanding Scope 3 emissions, about understanding really the full transparency of how a company is dealing with its carbon footprint. This does require education, and it also requires performance measures this is going to be key. So I'm going to turn to Nathan now, and I'm going to ask him to give us a little bit of a look on product labeling, financial advisors, performance reporting, looking at how current public policies for sustainability are going to be sufficient or not to prevent greenwashing. Jella went into some of the issues, but I'd love to hear what additional measures you, from that global aspect, you can advise on. Nathan.
Thanks, Jacina. I would say that the framework looks good on paper, in that we've got a performance benchmark in the taxonomy, we've got disclosures for the key actors, we've got financial product advice. We have a running late but promising labeling idea with bonds and hopefully future financial products, investment products. And we've got some of the backroom work, like performance benchmarks with minimum environmental criteria that have to be used as part of the reward structures. So on paper, the framework is there, but there are some risks. When you have an interdependent framework that relies on a sustainability-oriented benchmark, if that benchmark is not science-based, you institutionalize greenwashing in the rest of the framework. This is a material risk. If we call activities that are not green, then we will cause greenwashing. We'll cause Carlos to issue a product that has non-sustainable activities in it, but we'll require him to label it as sustainable. So there's a grave potential misstep here. We need to be very careful what we do next. And I'll tell you why it's important. Because there are genuine scientific uncertainties. Even our warming scenarios are, where we look at medians, they relate to a range of possible outcomes. If we find that there's more warming than we expected for a certain economic trajectory, then we're going to have to radically change the sustainability performance benchmark. And where are we placed on greenwashing then? When suddenly in 5 or 10 years, we're saying, actually, sorry, we got it wrong. That performance benchmark, divide everything in half. And actually, that's what's green. And suddenly we've just told the market that something's green for 10 years and now it's no longer green. So there are real risks, even with our best endeavors. And this is why I say it looks good on paper. So from a system design perspective, I think it works. But we must be really attentive to the detail. There's one other point I'd like to make. If we're running late on dealing with biodiversity, if we're running late on dealing with climate change, and governments intervene in the real economy to basically rule out or regulate away certain activities because they're damaging, where does that leave us with our transition assessment of those activities, that they might have had viable investment paths for 15 or 20 years and that they're environmentally friendly? But we've run late on dealing with climate change. And so governments are now saying, well, I'm sorry, if your building is not zero carbon, we're going to close it. Or if your road infrastructure facility cannot support certain types of recharging facilities, we're not going to allow vehicles on it. There are genuine risks to the way these investments play out. And this is why we must be so attentive to the science and the evidence that we're going to use here. But the framework on paper looks good at this stage, I would say. I'm not ready to introduce new parts to it yet. There's some things we still want to see on stewardship, for example. There's some things we want to see on duties, which I'm happy to add more detail on. But in terms of the financial product loop, I think we're starting to look pretty good on that.
Okay, so Nathan, we're starting to look pretty good. It's all there on paper. Carlos, now we come to you. You are really in the hot seat, let's say, because you're starting to apply it. SFDR is a challenge. We've seen in the press, all of us, sort of the issue of labeling Article 8 and 9 issue. What can you highlight on that? And I note, let me just tell all my panelists, we have 45 minutes left, so we need to keep to 2 minutes responses because we still have many questions, and I'm sorry because the topic is very, very interesting. I wish we had 2 hours more. That's my challenge to the organizers. Carlos.
Yeah. So for the SFDR part, there's a lot of product building, and as an asset owner, we also work with in-house asset managers and with external asset managers. And the way that we see funds built, it's way different from one asset manager to the other. There are a lot of particularities that led us to conclude that we needed an internal assessment framework that we could use to assess the funds with the criteria and the convictions of Allianz, and also with the goal of achieving our net neutrality by 2050. So we are hearing about Article 8 and Article 9, but we're challenging also that these Article 8 and Article 9 are, as they're built, are correctly built. The other thing that is of concern, and it's also linked to the taxonomy and greenwashing at this point, is that while we have a very good start, as Nathan mentioned, and everything looks good on paper, there are a lot of pieces of this puzzle missing. We see the taxonomy as a dictionary of activities that we can check and see, okay, this one matches, this one does not match. But there are a lot of pages missing from this dictionary. One of them, it's under construction, which is the social taxonomy. And as well, there's the idea of the extended taxonomy. And with this, we will have more activities to assess. And I bring this point to the table because when we have to report on SFDR, and by next year, next year as of today, without any delays, we will have to report on alignment while we have to report on eligibility for entity, which is something that it's also a lot of puzzling internally in terms of implementation. But coming to, if we have to report on alignment by next year, and we don't have all the pages of this dictionary at this point, investing in a healthcare company, which is not part of the taxonomy, and investing in an oil company enter into exactly the same bucket. And by putting them both in the same bucket, we are also opening the door to greenwashing, because an investor will not know if the 5% is if you have a 5% alignment, let's suppose, for a product. The other 95%, they will not know if it's a healthcare company, if it's a pharmaceutical, if it's a company that is producing tobacco, or if it's a company that is doing oil and gas. And this is a point of concern because it's sending mixed market signals. We also have issues with the fact that if we have a fund that it relies a lot on investments that are sovereign, then sovereign is not part of the taxonomy. So it would mean that there will be also some numbers that will not match an investor. So you have to compare equity funds, then fixed income funds based on taxonomy alignment, and then you will have to compare the sovereigns separately. And I don't know if the message and the investor will be able to read the little letters and say, okay, now I understand why this is this way, and if the investment decision will be taken in time, if they have to take into consideration so many things. So in the interest of time, if you have further questions later, I'll probably stop here so that I'll respect the time of it.
Thank you, Carlos. And that was very illuminating. And I'm going to turn to Nick to follow on from Carlos, because as you said, you're building these frameworks and helping all the different financial institutions build that sustainability, that transparency, avoid greenwashing, but really understanding all the measures, and also for end investors to understand. Is how can you help this whole process along when you see the huge challenges faced by Carlos?
Well, thank you, Justina. And Carlos makes an excellent point when it is his reference to the pharmaceutical versus tobacco, oil and gas sort of falling outside it. And that's why we believe that actually every investment fund, every investment should be measured for its sustainability. And that's the basis of our sustainable investment framework, is it's not just applied to so-called green funds, but the fact that every investment has an impact on the world, has an impact on society, on nature, and the climate, and helping investors understand that will help them make more informed choices. But at the same time, we need to make sure that they are simple, transparent, and robust. We're slightly suspicious of all the black boxes out there and the clever models that give scores, but you don't actually know what they're measuring, why they're measuring it, and therefore you can't make an informed decision. And we came across this when we looked at the performance of climate funds, and we took 15 of the highest rated climate funds by CDP and deconstructed how they were constructed, what their methodology was, what they were trying to achieve, and found that they were all doing very different things. They were not all actually labeled climate funds, but all referred to as climate funds in CDP, a very good body and a robust framework. But they were some were avoiding emissions, some were backing technology that was looking to reduce emissions, and therefore as an investor you would buy something thinking it was a climate fund, and it might be doing something very different between the two choices. So this is why we need sort of, I guess, clarity and comparability across it, and we need agreed industry standards and frameworks. Our answer to that was a temperature score, that every fund should have a temperature alignment score. Recognize that there are other approaches out there as well, and I am pleased to see with things like the formation of the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, with the formation of GFANs and some of these initiatives, we're starting to see coalescence around some agreed standards or at least frameworks, and we need to accelerate this, because at the moment it's a very confusing world to operate in. I imagine it's very confusing for Carlos to construct funds. It's certainly very confusing for the end investors to interpret how Carlos's funds might compare to someone else's funds. So I think it's about that robust, simple and transparent methodologies that are adopted across the industry.
So from the challenges that Carlos is facing, with the highlights and help that Nick and his team can give, and some of the issues that Nathan has raised, Jella, greenwashing, of course, is not the only concern, and you did say it in your introductory statement already, that costs and charges are really a big issue in any financial product, but notably, of course, in these green products, is going to be a challenge. Maybe also you could highlight a little bit what the review of audit might help to prevent greenwashing.
Very much so. Let me start by underlining that I completely agree with Nick. And as you know, I love this KISS approach. Keep it short and simple, because that's something the investor really likes. And if we look at the assessment of green products, yes, it has to be understandable. And it has to be, that's a very important issue, it has to be comparable. Because if not, the investor cannot make really a good decision. It should be a well-balanced decision. And of course, I also agree that financial literacy plays a major role there. And of course, I also see that audit would help. I mean, we would not only need a common standard to define it, but it would also be good if such a product would be reviewed and audited, so we all have the same standard, and then we have something like comparability. But of course, this should not only include sustainable investment products. I think it should be applied to all products, just to have the level playing field, and to offer the investor really a well-balanced investment decision. Let me also emphasize, and I think, Josina, you said it in the very beginning, we stand in the middle of this transition of the industries. And if I look at Germany, we see that the old industry with all the emissions is in the focus. And the financial industry, including ourselves, actually, we will have to play a major role to support this transition. And as you said, we need to have everyone on board. I think that's very, very important. So just to give you an example, if you buy a share in Tesla, that does not show that you invest in green. I think it's wrong. I think the approach should be, or the question is, who will be ready to invest in the old industry, in oil, gas, and coal, in order to lead them through this transformation procedure. And I think that's a major point where the institutional investor and the private investor can play a major role if all the information on the greenness of the product, on the costs and charges are really simple and easy accessible.
Thank you. And I think we come back to that transparency, and I'm going to go back into the loop on the more international, because we've been digging down into the EU, and of course that's the main focus of this panel, but the European Commission is leading this international platform of sustainable finance, which is looking to enhance coordination between regions, between actors. Again, could you highlight in a short statement what the main focus of the platform is? Because I think it's a key development, because it shows that the EU is not looking only within the EU, but seeks to really develop this on a global. And if we are to achieve a proper sustainable investing future, which is really going to work, it needs to be global at some stage. Andreas.
Thank you, Josina. So, of course, when we develop our policies, and we of course consult also with our international partners, it becomes clearer and clearer that we need to engage more, and that's what we are intending to do, and that's what we're doing. We, however, want to also engage on an ambitious level. So what we can't do is lose time if not all our international partners are on the same page. Having said that, there is work undergoing under the so-called International Platform on Sustainable Finance that we founded together with jurisdictions around the world. The work basically focuses on taxonomies and on sustainability disclosures. We think that it's crucial, and we see that more and more jurisdictions are interested to implement and to present taxonomies. But they are built somewhat differently. And overall, what can we do in the first step? We can compare these taxonomies, what we have done just recently. So around the COP26, we presented a first analysis between the EU and the China taxonomies. It's not a common taxonomy, it's just an analysis of how do they compare with each other. And also in the context of the G20, there is a sustainable finance working group. And this working group has looked at whether there are principles and recommendations that can be made for jurisdictions that want to develop taxonomies to make sure that we converge slowly. But of course, as I've said, it's important to maintain our own ambition because we need to reach our own goals. So we cannot always wait for our partners to be on board. I hope this was sufficient in terms of the IPSF, and I'm happy to answer any other questions also on the SFDR or whatever you want to come back to.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Kęstutis, now we always talk about this triangle of product governance, where we look at business conduct, product governance, and financial education. And several of the panelists have mentioned financial education, investor education, how important that is. But it's not only, of course, just the investor, it's the whole education for everyone. As representing and really representing a large part of stakeholders, what is your view on the issue of qualification of financial advisors on ESG investing and financial education for investors? What can you tell us on that?
Josina, I remember that you started your 6 points agenda with education. But usually what makes me wonder, when financial sector mentions education, it, at least, to my humble opinion, it looks like a little bit of avoiding real responsibility for what they sell. It's like, let's educate people the way we want for them to become really educated users of financial services. With sustainability added to this equation, things become even worse. Again, it's just hypothesis, okay? But when I'm thinking about incentive-based with a system working for ages of investment advisors now offering sustainability advice to their clients, will it not make matters worse? Because it can become then an engine for additional greenwashing. So if you put very good new element into a corrupt, into a let's say far from perfect existing system, things will not change. Things may get even worse. Yeah, we can open a Pandora box for even more greenwashing if we continue with the inducement model for sustainability advisors. Now, I'm of course I'm very much in line with what was presented earlier today from a group of NGOs talking about minimum sustainability competencies, for example. It was mentioned, I think, during the previous panel by some of colleagues. And I should add that those should not be just minimum sustainability competencies. Those should be really high and substantial sustainability competencies. And we need essentially to educate those advisors first so strongly that they can kind of really be certified with a strong body. And then we should check regularly what are the competencies they still maintain. And that should include mystery shopping. So that's how we can probably come forward with a little bit of hope of offering real sustainability advice to really sustainability inclined consumers. Other than that, I mean, if we don't put a really strong framework for this pipeline, we will get into a mess with this idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Kęstutis. I have one question from the audience, which I'm going to field because as we are really passionate about the topic, all of us, and timing will always be too short at the end. And it's a question for Carlos from what you said, that health can be a thematic focus under MiFID II-B category and under sustainable investments in SFDR Article 2. It doesn't need to be defined under the taxonomy. Now, how could this? How do you see this, and how could this work?
Yeah, I mean, even if it's within MiFID and it's recognized as one of the objectives, or is recognized as an activity, which is in our view also a very virtuous activity, when we report on indicators, healthcare is not yet included within the indicators that need to be reported, as it's not part of the activities that it's part of the taxonomy. So we cannot force an activity that is not in there within the indicators, and we have to classify it as non-eligible. And by classifying it as non-eligible, it means that it falls into the same bucket, again, as every other activity that is either excluded or that it's simply not part of the taxonomy yet. Hence the need for the extension. So it's just that the two regulations, we cannot use one to favor the other. So it's just to maintain the let's say not the sanctity, but the separation of both.
Carlos, and I think that makes it quite a bit clearer. I'm going to turn to the challenges of engagement. Jella, you said that the annual meeting is a key moment. Of course, it's a challenge because do we ask the right questions? Do we have the power? Do we have the time to ask the questions? All of these are important. We know that individual investors by nature are usually long-term. Their own balance sheet of life, they have a very long-term horizon. But how can we ensure that they can engage with the investee company? Is SRD2, the shareholders' rights revision that came about 5 years ago, is that suitable, fit for purpose? Is it easy to vote at the annual general meetings and explain your sustainability preferences? And I'm going to turn to both Nathan and Nick. And please, Nathan and Nick, limit yourself to maximum 2 minutes, please. Sorry.
No problem, no problem. Thanks for giving me the.
Jella, I want to first go to Nick and Nathan, and then I'll come to you. So I want to go to Nick and Nathan, and start with Nathan perhaps on the way COVID might have improved the way companies engage with individual investors. Can you just give a very brief highlight on that?
Yeah, so I think this is a long-term story in the making, because a lot of companies have wanted online and digital AGMs for a long time. But if I'm frank, they wanted it to try and manage the interaction and the control of the meeting so that it was a smoother process for the company. I don't think it's wrong to say that. But now we've got this interesting situation where, because they've had to use online methods for the AGMs, and they've actually provided reasonable access. At the same time, during the COVID crisis, we've got a lot of new investors coming into the market, individuals, and using the technology of these channels. And so by our assumption, engagement's actually gone up through digital channels relative to what many shareholder activists feared would be the case some years ago. So actually, we think we're getting a reasonably positive outcome out of the online channels. And frankly, that's the direction of travel because of the enabling framework of the technology. So we should recognize that. We still must remember, though, that original risk remains. When you've got this channel that is mostly controlled by the disseminating entity, so the company for the AGM, there is something to be mindful of about not cherry picking, not limiting the areas of discussion and engagement, which may, of course, push the engagement outside the formal channel, but nonetheless, there is a risk there to be monitored. So encouraging trends, but we need to monitor those same risks, that they're actually full and open participation channels.
Jella, I'm coming to you in a minute, but let me go first to Nick, because Nick is and his department are doing really quite interesting work with your fellow psychology department on consumer preferences and the impact of information on individuals' decisions. Maybe if you could highlight that, and then we'll go to Jella.
Thank you, Jacina. Yeah, absolutely. We worked with the psychology department and the psychometric center at the university to provide individual consumers, investors, with information about sustainability in fund fact sheets. These were actually around 3,000 US investors, individuals. And we provided them with pairs of fund fact sheets with different sustainability ratings, both environmental and social, and monitored to see how it would impact their decisions between which funds to go for. And I think we were remarkably surprised that about how much people prioritize sustainability. And this was actually, the experiment was done a couple of years ago and in the US. So this was the US under Trump. You know, this was pre the re-engagement of the US and the movement we've seen recently. And yet we saw that individuals were willing to sacrifice up to 3% returns to prioritize sustainability. We don't actually believe you have to sacrifice returns to create sustainability, but we needed to test where people's pain points were. Most interestingly, I guess there wasn't any difference between social and environmental measures. They were both prioritized. People wanted to avoid the most harmful investments rather than necessarily choose the most impactful. So it was either middle of the road or high impact were preferred over the lowest performance ones. But I guess it reiterated the fact that if you give people information about sustainability in a way that they can understand, then you will impact the decisions they make. And I think that sort of underpins again our sustainable investment framework and others out there about providing people with information.
Kęstutis, you want to come in before Jella, but because I was coming to you afterwards.
I will just give you some details on very similar study we did in our country in 2019, 2021. It was 1,000 people in a representative research. We asked very similar questions, and we got 2/3 of the population willing to sacrifice their returns. And the average return they were willing in a hypothetical scenario to sacrifice was around 16%. So those are European results from small country, I can share it with you later on. Thank you.
If you want to post the link, I don't know if the attendees can see the chat or the Q&A, but if it could be posted, that would be great. Jella, I'm going to talk to I'm going to turn to you because we've hovered on the field of Shareholders' Rights Directive, which was meant, after all, to really look at the plumbing of the system. It was meant to look at cross-border issues. It was meant to address a lot of these issues that we've been talking about. Now, is it really working? And I know there's been a study that Better Finance and DSW have published on this, so I'd love to hear some feedback on that.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. First of all, I agree with Nathan that we currently see a lot of encouraging trends. We see new individual investors entering the market. We see new technical opportunities, even at virtual general meetings. But I can also tell you, SRD2 is not working in reality. And I think that's the outcome of our brand new survey with Better Finance and DSW. We examined very closely whether the Shareholder Rights Directive 2 is being fully implemented in the member states in practice. So we did some mystery shopping. We fortunately have a lot of member organizations that bought shares cross-border. Well, that was the requirement, not on the national level, because that works. And we took a close look, first of all, at the most important shareholder right, and that's the right to vote. So actually, if I look at all the trends and the technical means, I would say, perfect, it would work out very well. But I can also tell you the outcome was a disaster. First of all, 59% of all the participants did not even receive the information, the cross-border information on the general meeting. And even if they received some information, the information was incomplete, let's say it this way. So how can you ask to exercise your vote if you do not even have all the information on the general meeting, and including the information on how do I get a voting card? So a real problem. And 54% of all the participants also indicated that they had real problems to access the information to ask for a voting card. This was not easily done by one click, as you might think. It was really complicated and time-consuming. So the outcome was very, very obvious, and I think devastating if you look at it. In 78% of all the cases, the shareholders was not able to obtain the voting card in time for the general meeting, so the shareholder could not vote. But that's not all, that's not enough. There is still another major obstacle in cross-border voting, and that is the issue of costs and charges, because you have this chain of intermediaries in this voting procedure. You have a lot of third-party costs, but also bank fees. And we took a look at the costs in detail, and they range from 10 euros per transaction up to 250 euros per transaction to ask for a voting card. Now, I think this is prohibitive and has nothing to do with the Shareholder Rights Directive 2. And to be very honest, I'm concerned because we are all talking about the European Capital Market Union, and we all pushing forward. But if even the cross-border voting procedure doesn't work, how can we really go forward with the European Capital Market Union? So this is just a summary. We publish it just very brand new, and I'm sure if you want to have more information, I can send you the link if you are interested.
Thank you, Jella. I think it would be great to provide the link to this study. Sounds very interesting. I was going to ask Kęstutis something on governance, but before I do that, let me turn to Andreas, because Jella, you said, how can we make CMU if all this cross-border voting is just prohibitive, not working, etc.? So the nuts and bolts of the system. So I'm just going to ask you, the new European Commission CMU package, we're still trying to complete this capital markets union. It's almost 7 years in the making, and there's been so many different new things that have come in. What can be done to really help CMU along? What do you see in helping the EU to transition into a greener economy? Andreas.
So a year ago, we presented a new action plan on the CMU, and you might be aware of it. And sustainability is one of the key features in this action plan. Also because of the opportunities that are around the interest from retail investors in this topic. So there was the objective that if we get this right, it might actually improve both the engagement of retail investors in sustainable finance, but it would also strengthen the capital markets union. Maybe to mention the package that the Commission adopted last week, Jella has already said that the European single access point was presented, and we really think that this could be a game changer if it's properly implemented. Because from one moment to another, you will have available all the publicly reported information from both companies and also on financial products in one database. And you can basically compare, and they use standardized reporting, of course. So I think this is a step forward where also fintechs and new solutions can be built on. And can help the investors to find the products that they need, also cross-border, maybe in a new way that we haven't seen so far. The Capital Markets Union Action Plan is quite broad, and I'm not going to speak about every single part, but I think what I would like to mention is also an agenda around open finance, and there could be a sustainability aspect in this as well. So basically, how can we make sure that the data that is collected from retail investors can be made available for third-party providers, so that there are new solutions and new possibilities being developed. I think I will stop here, and then maybe just to say on the Shareholder Rights Directive too, in our strategy, on our sustainable finance strategy that we published in July, we also mentioned that we will look at the Shareholder Rights Directive too, and see what can be improved in terms of engagement on sustainability issues. We are working on this,
I think the Commission, nobody can deny that you work extremely hard with all these different legislative measures, and but it is frustrating, I think, for users to see these costs are still around. And I think this, as long as we are all aware and we work towards the solution, I think the role of Better Finance in highlighting some of these issues is absolutely key, as is the role of the 𝗍𝗍𝗃𝗁, which Kęstutis is representing, because you really, you represent this very large, very diversified stakeholder group. And I'm going to come back to, we had this discussion at the very, very beginning of our panel on ESG, how we were all really focused on climate change. Now, the G, the governance, is very much part of that. We need to have G at the heart of it, and it should encompass everything. It should start before everything. What do you think that the EU still needs to do to improve governance and to really take into account all these different stakeholder interests in sustainability and in corporate decisions?
Well, I think the committee's stance on it is very well reflected when we come to a topic of workers' participation in the governance. Because for years, workers' group in the committee, the trade unions, are pushing the agenda of encouraging workers' participation in corporate governance, and nothing happens. Because the employers' group is essentially vetoing any progress on it. So we have two really very far away positioned interest groups with no potential progress, to find a common solution here. It's like it's becoming a taboo. And, with this type of approach, I think we are not really far away from the typical shareholder capitalism of very clear, distinguished, described roles of every economic actor. We are only talking about the stakeholder capitalism, but essentially there is no progress. And I'm trying to think in visions, but at the same time I'm attached to the realpolitik, and essentially I don't see any way how it could improve, except if we work very hard on social taxonomy. That's how things may improve. And if we come to the point when social taxonomy is as much advanced as the environmental taxonomy right now, the green taxonomy, the climate-related taxonomy, so probably in 4 years, in 5 years, then we have this debate coming to a much more, real implementation. Except for that, I don't see any other points. And my last remark on this, I'm also thinking about the role of intermediaries. Take my country as an example. We have 1 million people having their pensions in the second pillar funds. Now, it's 1 million. At the same time, we have only 10,000 people who actively work on stock markets. So it's a matter of magnitude of 100 times. Yeah, so it's 10,000 versus 1 million. And in this regard, the power is in the hands of few investment managers. Of course, some advisors as well, but mostly it's a matter of doing big moves with those few people instead of trying to educate, general public on how to engage in shareholder, participation. Thanks.
This has been, I remember, the Commission doesn't do it that much anymore, but I think at the very start of CMU, there were all these graphs comparing what was happening in the EU with the US, but it's a different world. We cannot compare it with all the best will in the world. And I think, we shouldn't compare it. I think we should grow our own way. Having said that, Kęstutis, let me just tell you that CFA Institute is coming out with a study on stakeholder capitalism in January, to which I contributed, where we look specifically to Germany and the workers' councils. So Jella, you might be interested as well. I'm conscious of time, so we have 10 minutes to deal with digitalization and innovation. We're going to come to this challenge. I'm going to start with Carlos, because digitalization, of course, fintech can play a role here to facilitate access to comparable investment products, to allow individual investors to engage, and some of the problems we have been discussing, all of this maybe or not can be addressed with fintech. But for Carlos, are there any innovative tools that can be used already now to promote access to capital markets for retail investors and to compare information on financial products? What are you seeing in your role there?
Yeah, we have one part of our portfolio is invested in a bucket which is called impact investing, and in here we see a lot of startups and companies of small size that are developing new solutions. It's very fragmented, I would have to say. There's one solution for one thing and one solution for the other, and as it is the nature of a startup to develop things like this. We have seen startups that can do carbon footprinting through drones in forests and things like this, or we can also see some other startups that are helping companies comply with the EU taxonomy and SFDR reporting, more on that reporting side. And when it comes to voting and when it comes to fund selection, some other startups are providing solutions in which, depending on your convictions, you can receive a questionnaire. You're going to be answering to this questionnaire, and you will end up with 3 funds that would match your convictions. I don't think that this provides the level of information that individual investors should have when it comes to this fund. And again, it comes to the point of Kęstutis with the intermediaries. We have a lot of solutions that are quite expensive that can tell you the percentage of a fund investing in coal or in fossil fuels, or in the future, we expect that this will be on taxonomy aligned activities. So we have a broader vision, but there is no access, sadly, for individual investors like everyone in this room for sure. So I come to the point that it is very fragmented, and that if we want to see something changing, we see a lot of no trading fees platforms like that, where you can have access to voting at the same time, but you don't have information on what are you voting on. You might vote depending on your conviction, but sometimes relying on a voting policy of your investment institution can also be helpful. And then the fact that these policies are transparent is one thing that you have to check, because maybe you want to promote that more women are part of boards, or you're promoting more independence, or you only want to make money out of this company because you are an investor that are more in the speculative mode, and then you would not be voting in favor of this. So I think that there's a huge market for startups on this. And I believe that in the next years, we'll see more and more solutions which are more for the public and less centralized.
Thank you very much, Carlos. So I'm going to go to my other panelists and ask each of them. I think, Andreas, you gave your vision on CMU, so maybe I'll put you at the end. But Nick, fintech and in any innovation, what are you seeing in your job that could help?
Yeah, thanks, Josina. We've really focused on thinking about technology to bring transparency, and that's less almost in the fintech world, but actually currently trying to think about how we can use technology and things like space technology to link on the ground impacts, deforestation or degradation of mangroves or things, to corporate behavior. So actually that bring that transparency that you can then measure and then use in the metrics to understand things. We convened a task force back in 2017 to think about fintech for sustainability, and we looked at 3 use cases: pension fund transparency, supply chain transparency, and also a digital coin for renewable energy to create sort of greater tradability of it. The one we explored was supply chain transparency, where we took tea from smallholders in Malawi and traced it using blockchain through to some off-takers in the UK, passing through many hands. So it's things like that we've been working on, but I will leave time now for others to answer the questions.
Thank you very much. Nathan, from your perspective?
Well, I think Kęstutis said it well. This is a structural question about how the market functions, and we can automate many of the intermediated steps, but you're still going to rely on advice in some form, whether it's automated or whether it's human. Somebody is going to need to aggregate. Let's take the idea to its logical conclusion. NGOs are the new proxy advisors, let's say, in a sustainable world. They're going to be the ones who can provide the overlay, if needs be, on the investment, on the voting decision of the. So I can press on the WWF advised proxy voting season implementation plan. Yes, I'll click on that one, thank you. But there still had to be someone there to say what that was. So I think we need to be mindful of this. The market structure, many stocks potentially in a fund. The other consideration is we've got to remember that a lot of pensions were set up with a specific social purpose, which was to provide a pot of money at the end. And so there's an actually design question there about how much autonomy do you want to give to the individual on the allocation? Is it mainly about signaling and helping to get preferences so that skilled individual that Kęstutis points to can make a better decision in your interests? Or are we actually devolving the decision-making authority? And then what does that do to the structure of the long-term savings system? So there's quite a few design questions to get here. The regulators are going to play a big role, but the technology will enable all of it. And so I think it's a question of how we decide to use it.
Thank you. How can we harness AI? How can we harness technology? Kęstutis, I'm going to give you 1 minute to give your wish list.
So from my case, the technology or fintech specifically is the only way we can overcome the fragmentation of markets in terms of geographical fragments. Because I will give you a very practical, my own example. I was trying to get a foot into a ESG investment a year or so ago. I was trying to purchase some ESG ETFs. And you know what happened? I went over to a website which offered ESG investments for Austrians, Germans, Belgians, few more countries, but my country was not on the list. So probably that's the only hope I can express on behalf of so many Europeans who are not born in those, kind of core and established all the capital market countries. So that's a big hope, at least. And of course, we can talk about challenges and risks and so on for hours, but at least, first of all, there should be hope, and then we will overcome those challenges potentially.
I like your positivism, and indeed, the EU should be for the whole of the EU. Jella, 1 minute to say your wish list in this interview.
Okay, let's say, first of all, I think it's an encouraging development with all the fintechs, because it really helps to change the equity culture, at least I can say it for Germany. And I think we have a very strong momentum now that we should really, I hope it will last a little bit longer. But on the other hand, nevertheless, I would say we have to take a look at the business model of these smart and neo brokers. And I always tell my son, who's 22 and just decided to start an account with Trade Republic in Germany, there is no such thing as a free lunch. So please take a look at the business model of the neo brokers. And they have something which is called payment for order flow, which is their kind of inducement. And I'm very glad that ESMA and also the EU Commission just took up the topic. The EU Commission proposes a ban of payment for order flow. I think this is a very important step forward. We will see whether the EU Parliament will agree to that, but I think it's a very positive development. On the other side, also challenging.
Thank you. I think this panel has been extremely rich in its discussion. It was a challenge for me to keep all of you engaged, 6 of you online, but we got, I think, all your views across. I hope the audience enjoyed it. And I think the to-do list is there. I hope that Better Finance and the other organizers take note of some of the wish list, take note of some of the issues that need to be resolved. But I walk away with, I think in general, my panel has been very positive and very hopeful. And I think that is how we need to approach this, not say, oh, it's too much. No, it's actually, we know we need to address it. The world is finite. We're not in an infinite world that we can keep on doing what we have done. So the revolution has to come. And with that, I see that perfect. We have finished on time. So thank you very much again. It was really wonderful to be able to have this discussion with all of you. Thank you from me.
Thanks a lot,
Josina, for your moderation.
What a pleasure.
It was a pleasure.